Greetings, hello from the void. It is I, Alf's Void. I'm here today to give us our first look into our first inquiry into some of the worst industrial disasters in modern history. Today we're going to be looking at the Union Carbide disaster, or also known as the Bhopal gas tragedy, that occurred at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India in 1984. This video is going to aim to answer the questions: what happened, why did it happen, what was the impact, and what do we learn from it going forward? So to answer the question what happened, the Union Carbide factory in India was owned partially by the US company Union Carbide and also partially by the Indian government itself. In the factory's early years, in the late 60s and early 70s, it initially produced batteries. But as times began to change, the company began producing pesticides. Specifically, it worked in diluting pesticide concentrates to then manufacture them into distributable pesticides. However, towards the beginning of the 80s, around 1980-1981, Union Carbide wanted to stop importing the concentrates of these pesticides and start manufacturing them at the plant itself. So from the years 1981 to roughly 1983, the joint companies spent those years seizing its imports and beginning to develop the equipment necessary in the factory in order for it to develop these concentrates itself to save on importation. Unfortunately, during this time period from 1981 to 1983, newer forms of pesticides that were much cheaper started to become available on the market, and thereby there was much less of a market for the kinds of pesticides created by Union Carbide. So because of this twofold factor, because of their loss in the market of the shares of their product being bought, as well as their investments in trying to redo the factory, the company was operating at a significant loss by the time of 1984. So with the economic loss of viability of the plant began major downsizing. It ceased production and dilution processes of pesticides and began storing the concentrates and packaging those products already diluted. In turn, it also began dramatically cutting its workforce. As the plant was operating at 1/5 of its operating capacity, there therefore was no need for such a large workforce. And moreover, although Union Carbide's managing and supervisory staff was initially trained in the USA and West Virginia, by 1984, almost all of those trained supervisors and managers with expertise in the operating of the plant had moved on to better paying positions. So essentially, the problems just discussed conclude more or less in the economic loss of viability of the plant and all of the things that come with that. And what that brings us to is how we get the state of the plant in 1984. The gas that leaked from the plant on December 3rd, 1984 was called MIC. It was stored underground in 2 large tanks, and between the 2 tanks there was just over 60 tons of the chemical. The chemical was supposed to be kept refrigerated in order to keep it from pressurizing and releasing into gas form if it were to overheat or if anything were to get inside of it, such as corroded pipe material, metal, anything which could make it have a reaction. The refrigeration was supposed to prevent this. However, it was found that the refrigeration unit for the storage tanks had been turned off months prior as a cost-saving measure, and the power that was keeping the tanks refrigerated was directed to somewhere else in the plant. This was the first mistake, the first thing that went wrong in this situation. However, it wasn't necessarily the fact that the tanks were not refrigerated that led to the disaster. Earlier that day, workers had been ordered to clean the pipes above the MIC storage containers above ground. However, while one of the workers was cleaning out the pipes to try to prevent corrosion, they noticed that something called the slip bind was missing. So essentially within the pipes there are certain slips that go in to prevent water from leaving one section of pipes and leading to somewhere else. So the worker reported this to their supervisor, and as I mentioned earlier, all of the USA trained supervisors had left the plant at this time. The supervisor that the worker reported to, the missing slip bind, essentially ordered the worker to proceed with the washing because they were untrained, unknowledgeable of what could happen, how the pipe systems work, and where each pipe led to. He did not know what would happen. Was not supposed to be in that position. This is a second problem, or perhaps the first. So essentially what occurred in the workers' washing of that pipe without the slip bind, the water mixed with the pipe corrosion leaked eventually into the storage tanks containing MIC, and MIC becomes violent or reacts when mixed with metals. So this is what is believed to have led to the tanks pressurizing. And since the refrigeration unit was turned off, there was nothing there at the tank location itself to prevent the tanks from pressurizing and forming a reaction leading to the expulsion of the chemical in gas form. If something like this were to happen, the company did have 3 methods of prevention in place if something like this were to occur, and essentially every single one of them failed. The first method of protection was something called a vent scrubber, which appeared to be working and operational. Essentially, a vent scrubber neutralizes gas leaks through a process of exposing it to caustic soda or running it through caustic soda. However, this method failed as the caustic soda itself was not being released. The second method of protection was something called a flare stack. The flare stack would essentially neutralize the gas through a process of flame neutralization. However, the first problem with this is that the flare stack did not have the capacity to deal with a leak of over 40 tons. It was meant for smaller leaks, not larger leaks. Whatever help it would have been in burning off at least some of the gas, the main pipe to the flare stack was actually removed and being replaced because the inner piping was corroded. So there was no replacement in place for while that pipe itself was being replaced. There was no temporary measure instantiated. It was just left to not be there in the event of emergency. The very last method that should have been there for protection was a hose, because MIC, once in gas form, essentially collapses underwater. However, the hose was not long enough to reach the top of the factory, to reach the vents where the gas was being dispersed from. So that essentially answers our first 2 questions, which are what happened and why did it happen? And the simple answer for why it happened is that both the Indian government and the United States company Union Carbide could not be bothered to take proper protectionary measures for both the factory workers' safety as well as the entire surrounding region of the plant. So to answer the question, what was the impact? Just after 12 a.m. on December 3rd, 1984, people in the surrounding region of the factory awoke choking and coughing, and likely to the sound of their loved ones choking and coughing on the invisible gas. People, once realizing that they themselves were not the only ones awaking, choking, and coughing, began to panic. People began to run from their homes. People were running in the streets. There was no emergency protection system enacted. The factory rung their siren alarms for only a few minutes and then turned them off. So people more or less went running through the streets. Some people died from being trampled. Essentially, there was no order to the event. It was a sudden onset disaster. The immediate death toll the next day was over 2,000 people were laying dead in the streets. In all of the region of the Bhopal, there were only 300 doctors to service all of these people affected. People were primarily complaining of respiratory issues. Other people's eyes were severely affected with burning sensations. And this problem was made even worse by the fact that MIC was a substance that had never been studied on humans. There's no known antidote for it. There's no known treatment for it. There's no known anything for it because there had never been a previous human exposure. Over the course of the years, it's believed that up to 300,000 people were affected by the gas leak. One of the most disturbing aspects of the aftermath of the gas leak and of those 300,000 people affected were the extent of birth defects found in people in the immediate region following the disaster. While there was some initial immediate financial compensation for those unable to work following the disaster, ultimately by the time the first round of compensation was submitted by the Bhopal government to the Indian Supreme Court in 1990, over 4,000 more people had already died who were eligible to receive compensation. And further, it wasn't until 2003 that all of those victims affected, supposedly, by the disaster received compensation for the occurrences that happened to them. Ultimately, while the most devastation occurred on humanity itself because of this disaster, it's also notable the extent of the dead livestock found in the streets following the morning after the disaster, as well as the decayed trees, the contaminated lakes, and contaminated soil. Often when looking at this tragedy, and most notably immediately after, most people's anger and hostility was directed at Union Carbide itself, as Union Carbide had also had other gas leaks, even in its plants in the US. So that is to say, Union Carbide is a company which itself has had a reputation and history of inappropriate or inaccurate safety practices. So while that is the case, and while that is justified, oftentimes people overlook the extent of the role in the Indian government in this disaster. So one aspect of that is, despite its half responsibility, its equally shared responsibility in terms of the shares of the company with Union Carbide USA, the Indian government is also supposed to take on the role of regulating, of inspecting, of making sure that all plants and factories are up to code and classified appropriately. And I note this because the Indian government itself chose to categorize the Union Carbide plant as general industry rather than hazardous industry. So what this means is, by doing this, more people were allowed to live around the factory and closer to the factory than if it were to be classified as a hazardous plant. So that is to say, if it was classified properly, there would have been a larger radius between the living population and between the factory in the event that something like this were to have occurred. So this brings us to the final question. What do we learn from this going forward? What we learn from this going forward is similar to what we'll learn from the coming disasters we'll also be looking at. And that is essentially the need, the requirement, the necessity, in some capacity, of global labor inspection standards. That is to say, through our series, we will see that time and time again, governments, both abroad and at home in the Western world, have insufficient means or insufficient incentive to properly inspect places of work and factories and plants, and specifically and most importantly, those which deal with hazardous materials. Governments by themselves cannot be trusted. This is what I have learned from my research into industrial disasters. Big business cannot be trusted to do the right thing when minimal investment will lead to more profit or profit saving. And government, who knows what their incentive is? I don't know why on earth what the government could possibly have to gain from taking such shortcuts. And more shortcuts we'll see. Because the hard reality of the case of Bhopal, very similar to the realities of the disasters that we'll soon be studying, is that if only the goddamned hose was just a few feet longer, over 300,000 people's lives would have been spared.